Welcome back to Loon's Leaves, y'all. Today we're going to be talking about the Japanese art form of Kokedama. So a Kokedama is a Japanese moss ball and mud ball that you're placing around a plant in order to kind of bonsai the plant. You're keeping the root structure small, but you're providing it with a source of moisture and nutrients so the plant can also flourish. This is called the poor man's bonsai because bonsai back in the day used to be very expensive to do. The pots cost money. Everything about the bonsaiing process was expensive. So in Japanese culture, people turned to creating Kokedama moss balls around their plants in order to bonsai something. So today I am going to show you how to make a Kokedama. They are quite stunning. There are lots of different things you can do with a Kokedama as far as placement goes. You could put them inside decorative bowls if you wish, like a wooden bowl or ceramic bowl. You could put them on a nice dish or even inside a cloche. So I have plans for this cloche and creating a very small Kokedama. So I'm excited about that as well. Along with how you place your Kokedama in your home, you can choose whatever plant you want for your Kokedama, depending on your personal preference and style. Any plant will work. However, you're gonna want a plant with some hardiness to it, and you'll see it kind of gets a little bit rugged during the Kokedama process of making it. So you're gonna want some sort of hardy plant. Most of the time, Kokedamas are usually some type of fern, but I have seen Kokedamas with all different kinds of plants. My personal preference is to have either a fern as a Kokedama or some sort of plant with a very hardy, elongated stem, and I'll insert some pictures of those here. Just because the balance of having the moss ball and the very long, tall plant, I think looks aesthetically pleasing. But I've also seen them done with shorter plants like succulents and even vining plants, which is not my personal preference just because then it starts to vine and cover up the moss ball, but it can be done. So I have one that I just made right before this video so I could get the hang of making a Kokedama for the first time. So it was a fairly simple process. I've watched a handful of videos on how to make Kokedama and I will link them down below. My favorite video through doing research was one done by IKEA. As if I couldn't love IKEA anymore, they put out a video on how to make Kokedama. So that's a wonderful video. I will link that below as well. So this fern came from this plant pot here that I have from a big box store. I think I got this at Lowe's. And you can see I've divided the fern into two. This was already done pretty much by the big box store. There were two ferns planted in this pot in order to make it look fuller. So I didn't really have to divide the root system or anything. They just crumbled away when I took the ferns out. So that's where this one came from. He's gonna sit over here. And then I have this second fern from the same plant pot. So I just divided the plant in half. What you're going to want to do next is crumble away any of that extra soil. You don't want a lot of excessive soil, and I learned that from making my first Kokedama. You want it to be pretty bare at the bottom, so you have an easier time forming that ball of mud around your plant, whatever it might be. Things that you're going to need for this process as well are, I have some sheet moss, that's the moss that's on the outside of the moss ball, the exterior. I keep wanting to say outerior. The exterior of the Kokedama is covered in moss. So I have sheet moss here ready to go. I also have some sphagnum moss. We're going to use that for the center of the ball. And I have some peat moss mixed with some soil and some regular houseplant soil that you can purchase at any big box store. I also have a jug of water, a few bowls and towels and things just because this process does tend to get a little bit messy. I have scissors, twine, embroidery thread, and a sprayer as well because it's going to be a lot easier for this process if you have some sort of sprayer to keep everything nice and moist and happy. So I am just crumbling everything away here. It's pretty barren. I don't want to do too much more just because I don't want to ruin that root structure. So I'm going to hold that up. There's a couple of clumps in there, but that should be okay. I might take a little bit more right off of the top here. That top layer of soil that's not really necessary. I'm also going to keep this to the side. We don't want really this kind of chunky, hardy soil because you're going to want to make a nice, fine mud. So this is what he looks like so far. Just a little bit of roots and some soil. And now I have my blue bowl here, which is empty for the time being. I am going to loosely form some sphagnum moss. So this is my sphagnum moss that I have here. I'm going to loosely form that around my Kokedama's base. And with my first Kokedama, I think I used a bit too much of the sphagnum moss because then it became hard to place the mud ball around it. Okay, so I'm placing my sphagnum moss around here. Just a little bit more, I think. I don't want too much because then it gets very tricky for the mud ball. Okay. It is pre-dampened sphagnum moss as well. A lot of the time if you're purchasing sphagnum moss in a big box store, it's going to be dried out, which is helpful because it'll make it significantly lighter and also fit more inside the bag they're going to give you. Now I'm just going to take a little bit of twine. This is kind of like a butcher's twine. I found it in a craft store, but butcher's twine would work. Any sort of thin fibered string or twine. Cotton would be a fantastic choice just to give it time for the plant to breathe or space room for the plant to breathe. So I'm loosely wrapping this around just to basically keep the sphagnum moss from completely falling off. And I'm going to just cut that. I'm going to leave it like this. I'm not going to tie it or anything, just this little chunk of ball at the bottom with that sphagnum moss, and I'm going to put my start of my Kokedama to the side. I do not need any more sphagnum moss. Now I need to make that kind of mud slurry to form around my Kokedama, to form the mud ball around it, and then we'll wrap it in that sheet moss. So there are a couple of different options for your mud slurry. They do make a bonsai soil, of which I do not have. I haven't been able to find that in any big box store. I'm sure you could find it on Etsy, and if I find some, I'll link it down below if you're really interested in keeping true to the form of the Kokedama. But you can also use any sort of fine soil. I'm going to use this peat moss soil here, and with the first Kokedama that I made earlier this morning, I used a little bit of regular potting soil mixed in, and I found it was really hard to form that mud ball with all these chunks and things in there. So you could do it completely with just regular potting soil, but I'm going to shy away from using that this time because there are a couple of chunks of orchid bark and things, some sticks and twigs that I would rather not have to deal with while forming that mud ball. So I'm going to take a few scoops of this peat moss, and I'm sure you could find like an exact recipe with perfect measurements and everything on Pinterest or Google. So if you are more of a perfectionist and you want a excellent slurry situation, then you could look up a recipe for the Kokedama mud. If I find any, again, I'll link them down below for you. So I have a good amount of slurry here, or peat moss. I am going to slowly add some water, so a little bit, and then I'm mixing it together with my hand. So this is a fairly messy process, hence why you're not really going to want to have your nails done or rings on, anything of that sort. If you do, you could probably wear gloves. I personally don't like wearing gardening gloves a lot of the time because I find them quite bulky unless I'm working with outdoor plants that might have thorns or like a hardier twig-like structure to them. But I have seen plant moms and dads out there wear nitrile gloves, or I think that's what they're called, like the hospital style latex gloves that you can get. And they wear those and it works out well because they're not as bulky. So just added a little bit more water. At this current state, I don't think I'm gonna have enough mud. Even though it's not completely finished yet, it's pretty chunky right now. So this is the state of it, still pretty chunky, and we want it nice and sticky, which it is sticking onto my hands, but we want it a little more sticky. So I also think I'm gonna just need more in general. So I'm gonna keep putting some more peat moss in here. Let's just go with the whole bowl. Might as well. Got nothing to lose. Gonna add a little bit more water because we want it nice and sticky so we can form a nice ball. Oh yeah, this is much better. There are a couple of twigs and things I've been finding in the peat moss as well. So in order to save yourself the hassle of when you're trying to form the ball, I would just pluck those things out so you don't end up poking yourself or having just like odd things protruding from your kokedama. Here's another one. Take that out. Okay. I think now I'm squeezing it and it is holding its form a little bit, but I think I want it slightly damper. Just a little bit more water. Now this would be a fun activity for any time. I mean, you could do it as a fun date activity. You could do it as a fun activity with your friends. I mean, forget the wine and paint night. Do cocktails and kokedamas. That would work out. I think that would be really fun, actually. Cocktails and kokedama night. You could do it for maybe like a bridal shower or baby shower activity if you want to get a little more down and dirty. Or just something fun to do now that we are kind of confined to staying more inside than we were in previous years. So I'm liking the consistency of this. It might not be damp enough, so I might end up spraying it with the spray bottle I have, which is really good for this entire process and keeping everything damp. So things do tend to dry out, especially if they were soaking wet. Like this sphagnum moss is already drying out. So I was just kind of comparing the size of this kokedama ball so far to how much mud I have, because through doing some research, I learned that the balance of the kokedama is really where the art form comes. Like, what's really important about the art form is the balance of the ball in comparison to the plant. And so you're not going to want a super huge mud ball and a really teeny tiny plant. Now that's up to you and your personal aesthetic, but traditionally you want a nice balance between both the plant and the mud ball. Now right now, before I go into more detail about balance of the ball and the plant, I am just kind of forming a ball between two cupped hands and squeezing out some of that excess water, and I'm getting a decent sized mud ball. It's all sticking together, it's holding its form. So I'm just forming that ball and making it slowly bigger by adding some more chunks of the mud. So back to the balance of the ball and the plant. I have seen kokedama where it's a little bit more unbalanced, and that might be a more whimsical look that you're going for. But traditionally, you're going to want to keep the size of the kokedama ball to be about the size of the vessel that you would normally store the plant in. So let's say I was potting this fern up instead of putting it into a kokedama ball. Then I would kind of look to see what kind of vessel would be comparable in size. This fern is pretty small, it's on the smaller side, and so it could easily be potted up in something a little bit larger and more elongated than this ball. So that's kind of what I'm going for. Something slightly larger than that bowl in height, but the diameter of this is really nice. So I'm gonna try to go for something of that size. I have a little bit more mud here, Now, this ball is going to get slightly bigger because you are going to be putting that, sorry, my dog is playing with a crinkle toy, so I might cut and give him a different option in a second here. But this is going to go inside your ball, so it is going to get a little bit bigger, so keep that in mind. So I actually think that what I have here, and I used up all my mud, is the perfect size. So I'm gonna rinse off my hands, clear a little bit of this area up because I do not want to have a lot of chunks of dirt and twigs and things when I go to put my sheet moss around my Kokedama, just because then it might get dirty. The sheet moss will look a little bit damp and dirty. So I will be right back, and then we will get to forming the Kokedama ball around the plant itself. All right, so I just briefly wiped off the table. I have my ball here ready to go. I have my fern ready to go with the sphagnum moss wrapped around it. And so now is kind of the tricky part with forming the ball around your plant. You also want to have ready to go some sheet moss. Now these sheet moss pieces are a little bit smaller than I would like, but it's what you get in your pack. This sheet moss size is more what I would be looking for, and in fact it might be a little bit too big. So you're going to kind of want to maybe take any twigs and sticks out of here that you can see that are going to protrude out, and if there's any lumps and bumps, maybe you can pull those pieces off. There is a thicker piece right here, so I'm just pulling off a little bit of the brown underbelly of the moss just to make it a little bit more even. There's kind of this couple of twigs, some looks like shells from maybe some acorns or walnuts. And I'm also going to, I think, cut off this piece here that kind of protrudes out, just so that way it goes around my moss ball a little bit smoother. Or my ball, this is the moss that's going to be part of the ball, around there a little smoother. And on my first one, I actually didn't have a piece that was big enough, so I did have to cover a patch of it up or patch it a little bit with a smaller piece of moss. So you can always go back and do that too. All right, so I am going to, this is the way that I mean, some people will form this entire ball of mud around this and then put it on top of the sheet moss. This kind of helps me keep everything within that I just made within the ball onto one surface that I could easily like fold back up around the plant. So there's a couple ways you can go about doing this. You can stick your thumb in here. There's the squeaky toy, inevitable. So you can kind of put your thumb in there, and you'll see that, hold on. All right, so I'm back. Just gave him another option other than the squeaky toy. And you can put your thumb in the center of the moss ball and kind of go around and pinch, like if you were a potter on a potter's wheel or forming a handmade bowl of some sort with clay, you'd kind of do the same kind of pinching motion around there. Or you can crack the ball completely in half and just put your plant in the center and then put two of the halves back together. So your perfectly made little mud ball is going to get a little disheveled in some way, so don't be worried about that. It will crumble apart. So I have just kind of made an indentation here. I'm going to go a little bit more deep with my indentation. And you can see chunks of my ball have been falling apart a little bit. And that's why I chose to just lay it right on top of the sheet moss. That's why it's nice to have a good big sheet of moss to put things on, because then you can just fold it all back up when you go to form the ball around. So I'm going to put that in there, and I'm going to squeeze a little bit. It's making some squishy noises. I'm going to squeeze a little bit just to form it more, so when I put the moss around it, it's not as challenging. There we go. This is a nice sticky mud. I did not get the same consistency when I made that first one, and I'm sure it's going to be fine. I'll keep you guys updated on Instagram and things like that. But it is nice to have a good sticky mud. Okay, another thing I'm going to do before I start to put the moss around is I'm going to give the moss underbelly a good light spray with my spritzer here. because that's going to keep it nice and moist and moldable. Right now it's dry because it was in a bag from that big box store. Nice. Spray the little outside on my ball a little bit too. There we go. And now it's pretty moldable. It was moldable before, but now it's going to be even easier. One more spritz around. I'm going to rinse my hands off, just so that way everything is off of them so I can form my moss around, because we want to keep the moss as clean as we can, because it's going to be harder in the long run to get all those bits and bobs out later. Okay, now this, as I'm folding it up, looks a little big. So I'm going to trim off a little bit of the exterior sections of the moss ball or the moss sheet, just so that way, actually that's probably, process comes in. So I'm squishing it, forming it a little bit, and I'm going to spray now the outside, now that I can see it, and it's going to help adhere it a little bit, kind of like if you were in a pottery class and you're slipping and scoring parts of your clay together by making that slurry of watered down clay, which is called slip. Then you're kind of slipping and scoring this by dampening it, and the damp on the inside is going to attach to the damp on the outside, and it's going to help you form your kokedama a little bit more. So I'm going to spray the bottom a little bit. It's already a little damp because this whole table's wet now. Okay. And now you're going to form it into the best ball that you can. You might get a little cracking in your sheet moss. That's why we dampen it, to kind of prevent that from happening, but it's a little inevitable. And then you are going to choose what you're going to wind around your kokedama ball to keep it all together in the form of a ball. So on this guy here, it might be a little hard to see. I can insert some close-up photos. I chose to use a colored embroidery floss just because then it's kind of inconspicuously around the kokedama ball, and it's a little easier to hide. So if you want to show more of that moss, if you want that to show through, then you can use a colored embroidery floss or cotton floss, or you can go with a butcher's twine. I have one that's a little bit more rustic and hardy here, thicker. There's some little fibers kind of coming off of it, so you could go with this as well. And I will insert some different photos of kokedamas. Some people prefer to have the kokedama string or binding showing, and some people prefer not to. So I'm going to do this one with the binding showing, just so that way you can see the difference between the two for a beginner's kokedamas as well. Because some people get really elaborate with the wrapping process of the kokedama, and I am not that skilled. So I'm going to probably speed this process up, but basically how you're going to start is you're going to leave a section of this string kind of draped across your foliage, so that way you have something to tie the last piece of string back to. And I'm going to unwind a little bit more of this so I can have something lengthy to work with. There we go. And so I have it just draped lightly across the foliage. I don't want to damage the foliage in any way. And I'm going to kind of squeeze and wrap as I go. Squeezing and wrapping. And again, you could make this really decorative, but I'm not that skillful. Maybe in the future with kokedamas. And I'm just wrapping, and you can also pause and kind of squeeze and wrap some more to really get that perfect ball-like shape. So I'm going to speed this process up for you all so you don't have to watch me wrap this kokedama. really confined this guy in here. I wrapped it a lot more tightly than I did my first one, which is, again, kind of all about the aesthetic that you want to go for. If you're looking more for perfection, then maybe you're going to want to wrap it more confinedly. There's a little spot here. Maybe I could do one more pass over. Or if you kind of like the more loose look, more natural look, you can go with the colored twine or the colored embroidery floss and wrap it a little bit more loosely. And again, it's kind of all like trial and error here. So I just cut the end of that there, and I have my piece here that I draped, my first starting piece that I draped into the foliage, and now I can tie them. If you want, you can even tie it into like a nice little bow. I'm gonna kind of make mine, I don't really want the tails of my string to show, so I'm gonna tie it into a couple little knots and then cut off that excess. All right. There we go. There's my Kokedama. So you can kind of see the differences. Sorry, my island in our kitchen is so long, so it's harder to get close to the camera. You can kind of see the differences between the two. This one for sure is definitely more round and more, I think, looks like a traditional Kokedama. This one has the naturalness of a Kokedama, but it doesn't quite have that perfect form. So I think I might even go back in as I'm looking at it now, and as it's been sitting on the dish that it's on, it's kind of flattened out on the bottom. I'm gonna go back in and kind of form this up a little bit more with the colored embroidery floss to hide that form more and make it more perfect. And then I am finished. So as far as that goes, Kokedama construction went pretty smoothly. For display, like I said earlier, you can put them in a dish, you can put them in a cloche, you can put them in a bowl, whatever you want. For Kokedama care, about every 2 weeks or so is probably when you're going to want to water your plant. And for watering purposes, all you're gonna do is fill a bowl with some water and then put your Kokedama in the bowl and let it soak up that water for however long it really takes. I probably wouldn't leave it in there for more than 2 hours just because then it's like going to be dripping wet. But a good 15 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on the size of the Kokedama. If it's a little bigger, you're going to want it to be in there a little longer. Should be good, and then it'll be nice and kind of hefty again. So a good way to see if your Kokedama needs water, if you don't have it on like a weekly schedule, is to lift it up every so often, and if it's super light, then you know it needs water. Everything's dried out. If it has a little heft to it, a little weight to it, then it probably could last a few more days. But because these aren't confined in any sort of planter or ceramic pot, things like that, they are going to dry out a little faster than maybe some of your other plants, which is why we wanted to wrap it with the sphagnum moss, because this really is a nice kind of spongy like material that's going to soak in that water and keep it close to the root system here. So hopefully this helped you learn how to make a Kokedama. It's a fun activity if you want to try it with friends or partners or whatever. And thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the future, and I'll keep you updated on Instagram.